One thing, though, that concerns me is I think there's a real possibility of a couple of so-called black swan scenarios developing. Not my central scenario, but very, very possible. I'm sure you're all familiar with the term black swan, coined by Nassim Taleb in his book Black Swan, and I think the power of the improbable events. Unlikely events which could cause quite large consequences if they happen. So I think there's quite a high possibility of two particular black swan scenarios. One is bad. That means growth is lower than expected, inflation stays low. The major central banks, the US, UK, certainly have their fingers crossed, and so does actually the ECB, that when the base effect of the fall in oil prices, which we saw at the end of 2014, disappears, which it was due to do at the end of 2015, then the base effect, the mathematics, mean that year on year inflation readings can start to rise towards, let's say, 1% by March or April. This scenario, this bad scenario, is that doesn't happen. The base effect goes away, and yet inflation is still stuck at 0.5, 0.6%. Then the central banks get worried. China, maybe in this scenario, doesn't do as well as I think. Maybe it starts with a 5%, the growth, very disappointing. And then we have geopolitics to worry about. Russia, the Middle East, relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran are at a low for several decades, you'd say. And the potential problems in the South China Seas over disputed islands. So many of those problems. And all of these mean maybe the Fed in that scenario stops raising rates and indeed could be forced to cut rates again, or even indulge in more quantitative easing. Ironically, that could be good for markets, possibly the risk markets, because they love the crack cocaine of liquidity and easy money. And then there's a second black swan scenario, which is not just bad, it's actually very bad. This is where the opposite happens. Inflation is much higher than expected. Wages are picking up quite rapidly. That is happening, by the way. We're seeing that already. There's been a couple of independent studies by the Atlanta Fed in the States and by ADP, the private employment consultancy, showing that wage growth is understated by the National Bureau of Labour Statistics figures, which are around 2.2, 2.3%. In reality, it should be closer to 3.5% when you compensate for what is known as the composition effect of the labour market. So inflation comes out much higher. I'm not talking hyperinflation. I'm talking maybe above 3%, heading to 4% by the end of the year. And this spooks the Fed, especially if China doesn't slow down. If you see a resurgence to 7%, commodities demand therefore picks up, which will itself create inflationary pressures. And we have the absence, thank God, of any geopolitical problems. This could cause the Fed to tighten much more quickly than the market expects, maybe by 200 basis points in 2016. And that's probably bad for markets as well in this contrary world where to a certain extent markets are driven very largely by the cost and supply of money right now. We should consider what happens in the bad scenario, the very bad scenario, because of the black swans, I think that's the more likely, that inflation is even higher than expected, heading towards 4%, 3-4%, and the Fed has to tighten even more strongly. Then I think all bonds will suffer. The high yield doesn't have the buffer to resist that raising rate environment. Equities will suffer too because of that tightening of money, cost and supply. Gold may weather the storm, and I think you have to hold some gold in a portfolio for that purpose, maybe in 10%. If inflation is really high, then it can weather a strong dollar and still appreciate it against the dollar. And in this environment, the US dollar can be super strong against other currencies, with the euro dollar possibly visiting the old lows that we saw, lifetime lows of 0.85.